Okay. And I think it's now recording.
Okay, I'm gonna record as well, I think.
Yeah, and then I will try like have it about like 5 minutes and then stop and then see whether I can find the tape on my computer somewhere.
All right. Do we have Eric on?
Let me see. I don't see his name. Yeah, I don't see his name.
Okay.
Yeah, probably not yet. Yeah. And let me start.
With him, about 30 minutes ago, so.
Let me see who's.
There he is.
Hello.
Okay, here's in. Hi, Eric.
There he is.
Long time no see.
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm good. Trying to turn the volume up here a bit.
Okay. Where are you right now? It looks like you're in your office.
I am. So I'm in my office at Nashville General. I have not worked a single day from home.
Oh, wow.
My team has worked from home. I mean, they're back now. They've worked from home a little bit, or they did work from home a little bit. But since I'm part of the executive team here, I was basically not allowed to work from home at all. So nothing has seemed different for me in this whole thing. So, but yes, I'm in my office over at Nashville General, not too far from where you are.
You look good. You look.
Well, thank you. I put on a few pounds that I need to. I think we all have. You know, months, so I gotta deal with that. But,
no way to exercise, right? Probably.
well, no, I've actually been trying to go for walks quite a bit. We've got a park that's not too far from our house, but it's just making the time, you know.
Oh, you must be very, very busy and overwhelmed, right? With like, reporting COVID-19, like
that's an understatement.
Every day update, and the news are so dynamic, and every day is different.
Yeah. For those of you, I know there's quite a few people on the call right now. For those of you who don't know, Christine and I actually go quite a ways back, and she is actually one of the primary reasons that I'm even in healthcare in the first place, because she introduced me to we both had the same boss for a while at Vanderbilt when I transitioned from the music industry of all places to healthcare, and Christine was instrumental in making that introduction. So I owe you a lot.
Oh, that's friends for, right? Yeah. I don't know why you and I are just like insane. We like first time and then we feel that we know each other for a long time, and I feel that I know you. I'm not sure whether I really know you, but I feel that I know you.
Yeah.
We are so much like whatever you talk, we talk, and I mean we are so insane, and so we are so matching, and then mindful, and so I just really, very appreciate having a friend like you.
Absolutely, same here. Well, and you and I, we're at a meetup right now, and you and I met at the data science meetup back in like 2014 or 2013, something like that. So, so those of you who are part of this meetup today, definitely stay active in these kind of things, because you never know what it could lead to, the connections that you make or something like this.
Definitely. All right. Well, should we kick things off?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, I'll do a quick introduction of our group and sponsors, and then Jason Morgan from Morgan Consulting will talk for a couple minutes. He's got he's one of the sponsors here. So let me go ahead. So yes, welcome to Greater Nashville Healthcare Analytics Meetup. Great to be back doing these. So thanks very much to our presenter today for offering to host and present to us. So yep, we've got our first Zoom meeting I think we've had, and looking forward to getting this recorded and out there and having the conversation keep going. So even though we're not part of the Nashville Technology Center here, I still want to mention them as part of our sponsorship, because they've done a great job in helping us with when we hopefully get back into the facility there at Tech Hill Commons. And I'll go ahead and hand things off to Jason to talk about Extractomatic, and then I'll introduce the speaker.
All right, well, thanks, Lucas, appreciate it. Lucas, I'm gonna share real quick, just share my screen so people can see our beautiful logo. There we go. My name is Jason Morgan. My company is Extractomatic, and we're the sponsor this year for Greater Nashville Healthcare Analysts. And what our company does is we make software that pulls data out of Cerner Millennium, which is one of the major EMRs that holds patient accounting and clinical data. We've got a lot of different customers across the nation, and we support analysts that do clinical and financial reporting for hospitals. So all we do is the software, we get the data out and we get it into analytical applications, data warehouses. We're basically a grocery store of data for hospitals. So that's what we do. We don't do the analytics ourselves. We leave that to you guys. You're the smart ones. Our job is to just make it available to you so you can focus on doing the awesome things, finding insights, finding trends, and identifying those types of things. So that's what we do. That's my pitch. Happy to tell anybody else about it. If you got questions or want to know more about it, sometimes people hit us up to say like, hey, tell me about how I can get into EMR data, or how is it structured, or what exactly is the kind of data that moves around inside of hospitals. That's what we swim in. That's what we do. So happy to answer any questions. If anybody wants to talk about it, just shoot me a chat message in the Zoom meeting. And that's it. I'll leave it to that. Unless anybody else has any questions for us or talk about us, welcome, Eric. I'm glad you're here to present to us.
Great, thanks. And I'll just say a quick short introduction for Eric. I wouldn't be surprised if most of you have heard or know Eric. He's one of the most active people in the Nashville analytics community, very generous with his time, from organizing meetings like the Nashville Analytics Summit, but many others he's been involved in. So much appreciated there. Eric is currently the Chief Analytics Officer for Nashville General Hospital. So quite a lot of experience and exposure he's had to the community and many different aspects to how analytics are affecting healthcare. He's also been involved in professorships for Lipscomb and Vanderbilt. But I'll stop right there because he's the one we all want to hear talk here. So I'll hand it over to you, Eric. Thanks for coming.
All right, appreciate it, Lucas. And yeah, I do recognize a couple of other people. Alan Clausen and I actually go way, way back. We were both members of the Toastmasters Club, I think about 17 years or so ago. So I'm not sure if he remembers that, but yes, I do recall that. So I'm going to share my screen here. And the presentation I'm going to give today, I've actually spoken about this topic a couple of other times. And this is, some of you, I don't expect a lot of this to necessarily be a surprise, but this is a topic that I'm very passionate about because I feel like this is something that as analytics and data science has continued to progress and continue to evolve, this is a real gap that I've seen in a lot of situations that can actually have a significant impact on the ability of analytics to truly be effective within an organization. So as you see the title here, this is really all about this topic of an analytics translator, which I'll define as we get more into this. And I don't expect that this presentation will necessarily take the entire hour, and I'm certainly open for questions, and we may have a lively discussion about other analytics related things at the end, so I'm completely open. But I'm hopeful that this will be some information for you to think about and to begin to consider how you can fill this role in the work that you do. So let me just start by, well, let me start by seeing if I can get the slides to advance. There we go. So if you've ever been to England, which I have not, but for those of you who have, you probably recognize this site if you've ever ridden the tube, as they call it in the UK. And you see this, this statement here that says mind the gap. And when we think about a gap, obviously within this particular perspective or this visual is talking about the physical gap between two objects. And so in this case, it's the distance between the edge of the subway platform and the subway train. But gaps can also occur between people. And in the mid-20th century, a social psychologist named John Wallen developed this systematic theory of communication that he referred to as the interpersonal gap. And his theory stated that each of us has intentions in every interaction. And what that means is that we intend to have a certain impact. We translate or encode our intentions into words and actions. The people that we are interacting with translate or decode our words and actions, and their decoding of that information determines the initial emotional impact on them. Now, obviously, when we communicate with people, all of those things happen almost instantaneously. We've all, been conditioned over years and years of interacting with other people to not really break it down into those steps. We just interact with others. But it's that theory and that idea of the steps of communication, and that is that idea of this interpersonal gap and how we fill that gap that's really important to consider. And primarily, the idea to keep in mind is that how we encode our message to another person and how that person then decodes our message is in no small part whatsoever influenced by the perspective of each person. So it's this idea of the perspective that's really critical to what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of this. And specifically, when we consider the exchange that might occur between an executive or a business leader and an analyst, and how the gaps might result, we first need to understand the unique perspective of each party. So before we go into how to become an effective analytics translator, we first need to understand the gap, which means we first need to understand the unique perspectives of each person. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the executive's perspective. And this gentleman that you see on the screen now is Dr. Joseph Webb, who is the CEO of Nashville General and happens to be my direct boss. But he serves as a good example of someone who has this perspective. And to describe this, there are a few things that we need to think about. First of all, this is a person who must work very hard to keep up with an ever-evolving competitive environment. So they're always thinking about the external environment in which the organization operates and what they need to be doing in order to maintain that competitive advantage and hopefully keep a step ahead. They're the ones responsible for taking action and driving results. So for those of you who have interacted with executives and in particular CEOs, you may not see them actually, it doesn't look like they may be doing a lot of necessarily hands-on work themselves, but they're responsible for setting the vision. They're responsible for making sure that the organization and themselves are taking the actions that are driving the results forward. They are typically, because of this, they're typically much more big picture oriented. When you think about scanning the competitive environment, when you think about all the various departments and all of the various elements within an organization, they have to manage all of that and think about how all of those capabilities and functions work together holistically. So it obviously requires that big picture perspective. They also, interestingly enough, typically lack full understanding of the potential impact of analytics and what is required to support it. Now this, when you think about it, it's not really surprising because most CEOs don't have a background in the kind of work that we do. And so understandably so, they're not going to be aware of all the nuances and the issues and the difficulties and challenges that we have in working in analytics, nor may they really understand all of the potential impact that it can have. And then finally, this is something you really see a lot. They often think that analytics must be highly sophisticated in order to be of any significant value. And I see this one a lot. I'm sure all of you have experienced this idea of, oh, well, we need to be doing machine learning and AI and deep learning and NLP. And if we're not doing those things, then we're not doing analytics and it's not really meaningful. Okay, so these are things that as you're thinking about what is the perspective of an executive, keeping these things in mind is going to help you close that gap when you have these interactions. So now let's take a look at the analyst perspective, which we should be much more familiar with. So this is going to be contrasting with the executive. In this case, we must work very hard to keep up with ever-evolving tools, methods, and technologies. All of us know that the world of analytics evolves at a very, very rapid pace. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do to make sure that we're staying on top of these new developments as much as we possibly can. We're obviously responsible for analyzing data and providing information. That's our role. That's what we're hired and paid by our organizations to do. And I have a lot of philosophies and soapboxes and things that I'll get on. And one of the things I like to say is that data in and of itself is completely worthless. It's not until you turn that data and you aggregate it, you visualize it, you model it, you do something with it that converts it into information, that's when it becomes valuable. So data by itself is nothing without converting it into something. I think we all understand that, but I just like to make that point. We obviously, in contrasted to executives who are very big picture oriented, analysts are typically very detail oriented. We live in the details. We live in, for those of you, I'm sure all of you have written code to some extent, you know that one incorrect character in 3,000 lines of code can break it. So we have to be very detail oriented. To contrast with the executive who doesn't, perhaps understand the full impact of analytics, many analysts lack the full understanding of the business and thus how to deploy analytics for maximum impact. And this idea of deployment is obviously very critical to analytics because you can build the most robust machine learning algorithm, but if you don't have the ability to deploy it and place it into use where it's actually having an impact, then all the work that you've done is really not all that, is not worth very much. And then finally, the analyst often thinks that analytics must be highly sophisticated in order to be of any significant value. So you'll notice this is the exact same point that we saw with the executive. And we as analysts, we often want to migrate or lean toward the more sophisticated models, the multi-stage algorithms, all these different things. So we don't want to mess with doing a simple visualization or, Tableau is kind of cool, but that's retrospective. We don't want to look at that. We want to be building predictive analytics. So we often also fall into this issue, thinking that we have to make things more complicated than they actually need to be. So considering these two different perspectives, this is where we start to think about how do we close this gap. And this is where the idea of the analytic translator comes into play. It's that idea of bridging that gap between these two disparate perspectives, these two very different ways of thinking about the world and thinking about the organizations within which we operate. There was a really interesting study that McKenzie published back in December of 2016, and it is a few years old now, but it's still very relevant. And if you, it's available. If you have the time, I would highly suggest reviewing it. And there was a lot of really interesting findings and forecasts or predictions that came from this particular study. But one thing in particular that was very notable is they made this comment that they projected a 2 million to 4 million need in the number of what at the time during this report they called business translators over the next decade. And so this particular report was, at least in my experience, the first time that I saw this term of business translator actually utilized. And we're going to talk in just a moment about what it is, but it's a lot of the information within this report was very technological in nature, talking about new systems, new databases, new algorithms. But this one was really more in a different perspective than the others. So fast forward a couple of years, and the term business translator has actually somewhat evolved into what's now called an analytics translator. And this particular article that you see here was, it was also from McKenzie and was published in conjunction with Harvard Business Review. And I actually have the URL to the report of the website as you see here. And I think we're going to make the slides available afterwards, so you'll have this particular URL if you want to read the full article. But you can see the little blurb on the bottom that it mentions the search for vital analytics talent has often focused on data scientists, but in this particular article, we describe the overlooked analytics role that's even more critical to fill. So the idea behind this is that there's been such a focus on the technological skills and the ability to build sophisticated models and work with very complex databases and distributed and all these different things, but we're missing something. And that's really the point of this whole thing. So let's now think about what exactly is an analytics translator. So I'm going to get to the first paragraph here in just a moment. I'll come back to that. You can see I say I don't necessarily agree with it, but I'll explain why in just a moment. If you look at what's highlighted, or I should say underlined here in the middle, you'll see that it says, translators play a critical role in bridging the technical expertise of data engineers and data scientists with the operational expertise of the various areas of the organization. And in their role, translators help ensure that the deep insights generated through sophisticated analytics translate to impact. That's an important word, to impact at scale in an organization. And then finally, on the bottom, you see, what does a translator do? They draw on their domain knowledge to help business leaders identify and prioritize their business problems based on which will create the highest value. So I think you can get an idea of what's going on here. And the way I like to think about it is that as the worlds of business and the worlds of analytics and data science get more and more and more sophisticated, the lexicon and the knowledge base within those becomes more and more disparate to the point where you're basically speaking two very different languages. The translator role helps bring those together. I think we've all heard, I know I've heard my share of these situations in which an organization decides that they want to invest in data science. So they go out and they hire a bunch of PhDs and a bunch of other people who have deep domain experience in building very sophisticated models and developing these types of algorithms. And then they might, if they're wise, they might set up a separate team for them, but often they'll just stick them in IT somewhere. And they just assume that because they've made an investment in data science, that it's magically going to result in all of these improvements and all of this, all these discoveries coming from this team. And often what I see happen is these initiatives fail for many reasons, but in many cases, there's always, or there's often this situation in which one of the reasons for the failure is simply a fact that one doesn't understand what the other are doing. I've heard many cases where, or examples of a company that's hired data scientists, and they say, I don't really know what they're doing. We're spending hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on this data science team, and I think they're doing stuff, but we're not seeing anything. I have no idea the impact that it's having on the organization. So that's the idea behind the analytics translator. Now, the reason, and I'm going to go back up here to the first paragraph under the definition here, and you'll see that it says, to understand more about what translators are, it's important to first understand what they aren't. And the article says that translators are neither data architects nor data engineers. They're not even necessarily dedicated analytics professionals, and they don't possess deep technical expertise in programming a model. The reason I don't necessarily disagree with this is because what's important to realize when you read the McKenzie report and you think about the way that they present it, they are considering an analytics translator to be a separate and distinct standalone role, meaning that they expect that an organization will hire a person they may not have the title of analytics translator, but that is their sole position or the only role that they fill. And all they're doing is just being that go-between between the executives and the analysts. Most of the organizations that I know of, even today, with the exception of your, large multi-billion-dollar, multi-global or multinational organizations, are not going to have the resources nor necessarily the desire to hire a person that will fill only this role. Okay, so the reason that's important is because if an organization is not going to hire someone to serve as just an analytics translator, what that means is that now the onus on filling that particular role falls on us as the analysts, because it's typically because of our placement in the organization. An executive is not going to come to our level. They're not going to learn the language that we speak. They're not going to learn how to speak in code. They're not going to learn how to speak in model terminology or in database terminology. Therefore, instead of them coming to us, we have to be able to go to them. And that's the reason that I don't necessarily agree with this point, because I think it is possible and sometimes even preferable that a person has that data background, that they might be an architect or an engineer, or they may have a lot of experience building very complex models, but they can also serve as an analytics translator. In that situation, what they're doing is they've cultivated the ability to describe the work that they do to executives and other business leaders in a way that those individuals can understand it. So they are, as the analyst, they are closing the gap themselves by translating their work into language that other people can understand. So that's the setup for this. And in the remainder of this presentation, what I'm going to talk about are, and this is not an all-inclusive list. I would say there's definitely some things that I've left out of here, and we can have a conversation about that. But in my experience, in working as an analyst for 20 years and serving several roles and being in different levels of the organization, from my perspective, these are what I feel are the 6 primary keys for becoming an effective analytics translator. So the first one, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit, is to understand your organization from that executive point of view. So we've already discussed how we have to meet the executives where they are. So one of the primary ways that we do that is to be able to get inside, walk a mile in their proverbial shoes and understand things from their perspective. So one of the ways that you can do this is to interact with executives and just learn what they're concerned about. Understand what are their problems, what are their challenges, what are they trying to accomplish, what are their expectations, how are they being managed, or how are they being evaluated for their own performance, because obviously that's going to motivate them and that's going to help you understand what it is they're trying to accomplish. Another thing is to ask for opportunities to be present for executive discussions. And I've worked at organizations that are both open to this, and I've worked at organizations that basically said, if you're not part of this executive team, you are not allowed in the ring. So culturally, you have to think about that. The idea behind this is, if you are spending most of your time at your desk, in your cube, with your immediate team, and not getting exposure to discussions at an executive level, you're not going to necessarily be aware of what is the executive team most concerned about. What are the things that they're worried about, or that they're strategizing about, or that they're focused on developing for the next couple of years. It's all about cultivating and further developing that idea, or that perspective of thinking. Another thing I would recommend is to search for an executive sponsor, and that's a person who is at the executive level or senior management level, who can be a champion for you. If you're in a large organization, this is maybe not as important in a smaller organization, but if you're in a large organization where you're struggling to get noticed, and maybe you're starting to develop some things and you feel like it could really benefit the organization, but you're not getting the exposure to the work that you would like, having someone who can advocate for you and serve as a sponsor for you and basically bring you to the table and help bring the work that you're doing to the eyes of people in the organization who would really appreciate and benefit from it, can really help you get access to that team and further cultivate that perspective. And as you're doing this, something else that will come along, and you can think about it separately as well, is thinking about and seeking new opportunities for applying analytics to important business problems. So if you're able to do one, if not all of these 3 points that I listed previously, you're going to start to understand, okay, what are the primary issues, challenges, objectives that my organization is really focused on. And if you do that, now you can start to think, from my perspective, from the data that I have access to, from the types of algorithms that I know how to apply, from the tools that I have at my disposal, how can I begin to put that information together and apply what I can do to what I know are some of the business's largest issues that they're dealing with. And then finally, if you don't really understand much about your industry outside of what just your organization does, or if that's, you know, if you're one of those who you basically go to work and you write your code and you build your models and you create your dashboards or whatever the case may be, and then you kind of let it go at the end of the day, I would challenge you to learn more about the industry beyond the four walls of your organization, because that's the way your executive team is thinking about it. Obviously, they're concerned about what's happening inside the four walls, but as I mentioned earlier, they're thinking much more about the competitive environment. They're thinking about regulations. Obviously, in healthcare, there's a lot of those types of things that we have to be aware of that can significantly impact an organization. So it's that idea of just broadening your perspective. So key number 2, and I'll stop for a moment in case anyone has any questions. I don't want to just, I sometimes will barrel through a presentation, so I'll just pause for a moment. I think, Lucas, is there like somebody watching, somebody raises their hand or something like that? Because I'm not seeing that on my screen. But
yeah, at the bottom, there's a participants. I'm taking a look here.
Okay.
So just make sure you're unmuted. I don't see any questions.
Okay, good. Just wanted to not barrel through everything. So key number 2 is to define problems thoroughly and accurately. And you see this quote over here from a well-known inventor, Charles Kettering, who said, "A problem well stated is a problem half solved." And this is another thing that I see a lot of, especially aspiring analysts and data scientists, not really spend enough time on, and it can get them into trouble. So the very first thing to consider is just begin with the end in mind. For those of you who are familiar with Stephen Covey, you've heard this term before. That is, before you even start anything, think about what is the end goal going to look like? What are you ultimately trying to accomplish, trying to build, trying to put into place? And this point I cannot underscore strongly enough. That is to focus on the business problem first and then decide how to solve it. And keeping in mind that the solution may not always be a sophisticated model. That goes back to that point that sometimes we as analysts, we want to find the most sophisticated solution that we can when that may not be necessary. So don't introduce complexity just for the sake of it. Obviously, if it's required, it's required. So another way to think about this is to take the time to frame the problems thoroughly before simply jumping into the data. This is something that, and I struggle with this too. I think we all do, those of us who have a proclivity of working with data. If you have access to a database and you can write SQL fluently, you know that you can build a massive data set to just put all these pieces together. And sometimes we just want to start with that and then start jumping into it and throwing some algorithms at it and seeing what starts to jump to the surface and doing all these things without first thinking about, okay, why are we doing this? What are we ultimately trying to solve here? And I've heard of so many cases where an analyst will skip this step and build something that they think is phenomenal, and they find out actually it has no relevance whatsoever in what the actual business problem is, which is a complete waste of resources, and it can actually undermine the credibility of an analyst or an analytics team, especially if it's fairly new. And another thing that is really helpful with this is to meet with key stakeholders to gain their input and perspective. So you don't want to just assume that you know what people want. And the other thing I would say, and I'm a little fortunate at this organization that I'm part of the executive team, and so it's a little easier for me to say this. Sometimes, depending upon your position in the organization, it may not be. But anytime someone, and it took a while, this is something I walked into when I came to the organization, is there was just this idea of, okay, I go to this analytics team and I just ask them for data. Can you give me, I need this data that has this field, this field, this field, this one, this one, and this one, and then can you make it for the last 2 years and then sort it based on that? And that's all I need, just give me that. And then you respond to that and you give them that data. If any of you have been in that situation, you know that 9 times out of 10, what happens is they come back and they say, oh, that didn't really answer my question. Can you now add this to it? And then maybe add another year worth of information and then send it to me again. And throughout this whole exercise, you have absolutely no idea what they're actually trying to accomplish. You're just being what I call a data regurgitator, which really adds no value. So the ability to meet with stakeholders and, you know, when they come to you and say, can you just give me data, to say, well, can we spend a little bit of time, help me understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. Help me think about, from your perspective, what is the end goal? It's getting that context. So that's something that's very helpful. A framework that I want to introduce, and Christine is probably going to smile at this because we were on the same team at Vanderbilt that we utilized this. So this is a framework that McKenzie Consulting utilizes, and they call it the problem statement template. This is used by McKenzie. It's one of the tools that McKenzie Consulting teams use, not the only one, but it's one of the ones that they use when they are in an engagement with a client organization. And it's all around defining the problem to be solved and thinking about all of the different facets of a particular organizational problem before any kind of solution is even prescribed or considered. And again, that's where really we as humans don't like to focus on defining the problem. We just automatically want to try to find a solution. But if you take that route, in many cases, you end up creating a solution to the wrong problem. So this particular framework, the way it works, I'm not going to go through all of the different elements here, but there's 7 criteria or 7 elements to this. And the most important one you see on at number 1 is the basic question to be resolved. And it may or may not be, I'm sure you're all familiar with the SMART acronym: specific, measurable, action-oriented, relevant, time-bound. You may hear variations of that. But it's all about being specific. That's the most important thing, is, you know, to say, okay, we want to improve throughput. Or how do we improve throughput? Okay, well, what does that mean? How do you define throughput? You've got to get more specific than that. Are we talking about throughput in the OR? Are we talking about throughput in the ED? Okay, let's say we want to improve throughput, or how, maybe, because it needs to be in question form, so it might be, how do we improve throughput in the ED? Okay, that's getting a little more specific. Is there a particular time of day? Is there a particular type of patient? Is there a particular team or physician that we're looking at? So it's that idea of funneling things down so that we can get to a more specific question that can actually be addressed with an analytic solution. Some of the other elements that you see here, number 2, is context. That's just, you know, more information around it. Criteria success, that's the end in mind. So going back to that point of the end in mind, if we're successful, if the analytics team develops something that addresses this problem successfully, what does that look like? Number 4 is very important. It's that idea of, we're not going to boil the proverbial ocean, that we're going to focus on this and this alone. There might be something over here, or there might be something over here, but we're consciously deciding we're not going to include those within what we're going to deal with. We're only going to deal with this. So maybe it's, maybe it has to do with a certain shift within the ED. Maybe there's the overnight shift, that we're just going to look at that because we recognize that's an issue. So we're not going to think about other teams. We're just going to think about that. The other 5 and 7 are somewhat similar, but it's just thinking about what are some of the things that could get in the way? What are some of the things that could prevent your solution from being successful? And then number 6 are your stakeholders. Those are the people who have, they make the decisions, or they can provide support, or could potentially derail the project. So you have to think about who are all the players involved that might have a say in this, that might be impacted by what is developed, that may have some vested interest in the outcome in some way. So you can see that going through an exercise like this forces you to think about a lot of different elements of a particular problem versus just, how do we fix this? Okay, well, and typically what I've experienced when using this particular framework, you're iterating, as you're getting more information, you're going back to your basic question and you're restating it, because you're identifying new information, you're thinking about potential elements that you didn't consider originally. So that question gets refined to the point where once you've gone through this exercise, everyone agrees, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And I've seen it in many cases where the conversation starts with a question, and then after going through something like this, the question is very, very different from what was stated at the beginning. And this is the kind of thing that you really, if you have the ability to, you shouldn't do this on your own. You should do this, going back to that point about involving key stakeholders. They should be a part of this process because they know what the circumstances are and the business issues probably better than you. Okay. So key number 3 really has to do with how you interact with others. And really it comes down to being a collaborator, not just a responder. So I mentioned earlier that I have a lot of philosophies and soapboxes and things that I get on. And one of my big ones is that analytics should be a partner, not a resource. So when if you're filling that role of someone coming to you and saying, I just need this data for these fields in this time period, you're being a resource. All you're doing is providing them something. You're not really adding any value other than just, extracting some information for them as they've requested it. A partnership really is when you are able to see things from their perspective. So there's the word perspective again. And you're sitting side by side with them, and you both have the same end goal in mind from a business perspective, that you want to improve throughput in your ED overnight, or you want to reduce the number of infections within the hospital, whatever the case may be. You're seeing things from the same perspective. And when you start to develop that working relationship, that's where things really start to come into play. So to do that, you want to understand and embrace the interests and concerns of those you are serving. You're going to be focused on the things that you need as the analyst, but you really want to get inside the mind of the people that you're helping and try to see things from the way they're seeing. There's an approach that I like to call engaged iteration that I've seen. This is what we really did when I was part of the team at Vanderbilt with Christine, that I saw really help things move along, and it led to a much better solution than experiences I'd had in the past where this wasn't the case. So by engaged iteration, really what this means is that you're supplementing the philosophy of recurring project development with the benefits of consistent and meaningful interactions with stakeholders. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Agile framework. So I like to think of it as somewhat similar to Agile, but you're not necessarily doing sprints per se, but you are hitting milestones. You're not going away for 6 months. Say, okay, we understand the problem, so now we're going to go away for 6 months and build this thing, and then we'll come back in 6 months and, okay, here you go. Here's what we developed. Instead, or maybe it's even 6 weeks or 3 weeks. It could be that short of a time frame. That still can be too long. Really, it's this idea of as you're developing, as you're creating a new visualization or thinking about introducing new features into a model, getting those people involved, continuing to bounce ideas off of them. Okay, I'm thinking about incorporating this. Would this make sense? I'm thinking about a visualization that would show this by this. Does that help you? Does that resonate? Let's talk about that. So there's really 5 stages as I see to this, and it's sort of a loop. in a way. At least the middle part of it is somewhat of a loop. So we've already talked about step number one, or stage number one, which is determining the basic question to be resolved. And that's really your ground zero. That's where you have to start. Then I see stages 2, 3, and 4 as somewhat of a cycle. So number 2 is designing the analytic solution based on the problem definition. Obtaining frequent, phase 3 is evaluating, which is obtaining frequent and constructive feedback from stakeholders. And then number 4 is deploying it, where you enable stakeholders to utilize the solution. So if you think about it, the iteration part comes in steps 2 through 4. So in the development stage, you may not develop the entire solution in its final form. You may develop the first, so for example, if you're developing a tablet, a dashboard in Tableau, you might develop the first 2 tabs, or maybe a couple of pages of a story or something like that. Then in stage 3, you take it back to them and you say, okay, here's a first version of this. What do you think about this? And get some reaction to it. And they'll say, oh, I like this. This makes a lot of sense. This is not really relevant for what I need. Can we add this? Can we change this? That's the evaluation. And then you deploy based on that feedback. And then when you deploy something, we all know that it's very rare that we develop a solution and never touch it again. The types of things that we develop are always iterating in some way. So you might deploy that dashboard, and hopefully something that we actually do at the hospital with some of the dashboards that we've developed, especially if a committee is around them, we're having a regular, it might be quarterly, series of meetings where we are essentially going back to the evaluate phase. And saying, okay, assuming your business has changed over the last 3 months, or some new project has come along, or a condition is happening, what do we need to do to modify this to make it more useful? And then you can go back, that's where you go back to the development stage. You might modify your solution, get additional feedback, deploy the new version, and that cycle just tends to happen over and over. Now, you don't have to complete all of the cycles before you get to step number 5. Really, step number 5 can happen after the very first development phase. But as you continue to iterate and as you continue to develop that solution out, the promotion of it, that idea of having widespread use of the analytic solution, is critical. The main reason why I feel that this idea of engaged iteration is so important is because what you're doing is by nature of the way it's defined, you're involving, that's the engagement part of this, you're involving the end users in the development of your solution. Even though they may not understand all the technical elements of it, they are contributing in some way to the development of what you're doing. And the reason that that's important is because that will significantly increase adoption of your solution. All of us are going to be much more likely to use something that we had some sort of hand in helping develop. That's really what it comes down to. So that idea of getting and having that collaborative approach and getting your end users involved is really critical. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit because I realize we're already coming up on close to an hour, and it's kind of flying by. Key number 4 is to go from data to story. So it's this idea that we want to think about presenting our information in a story. So as you develop your analyses, take a moment to think about the so what. Don't get so enamored by the technical elements of what you're developing, but think about it, sort of step back from it a moment and think, okay, if I'm an end user, why is what I'm developing important? Why is this model going to be useful? Why is this visualization, how is it going to help drive a particular action? Another thing I would add is to think horizontally, not vertically. What that means is when you think vertically, basically you're going in this direction and you're getting very, very detailed. You're going into one particular topic going through various levels and getting into a lot of detail. But when you think horizontally, what you're doing is you're thinking more in this direction, and you're tying all of your various elements of your story or your analysis to some central idea, belief, theme, whatever the case may be. You're unifying your message such that people can better understand it. If you've had a situation where you've given, you're telling a story and you're going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into a particular topic of data, you're going to lose people very easily. So that's another reason this is important. Incorporate necessary context so people understand why what you're your analysis, why it's important. And this, this information here, these 3 points come from a presentation that was given a couple of years back at the National Analytics Summit that Lucas mentioned earlier. And it was a really interesting presentation, and there were 3 sort of, they call them data storytelling principles that were presented. And the first one is to start with people first. That is, don't focus on what necessarily you want to convey from your perspective, but instead focus on what the audience is interested in. And this is often very different from what you might want to focus on. For example, most of the time, your audience is not going to be concerned or even interested with the R-squared regression model or the confusion matrix of a logistic regression model or any of the other diagnostics that might be in place with a model. You find them very fascinating, especially if your model fits very well. Your audience is probably not going to care. They want to know, how is it going to help me do my job? The second principle is to guide your audience to interesting places, help them discover what's noteworthy, unexpected, and meaningful. Having a horizontal story where you're taking these different elements and tying them all back into some ultimate point can really help underscore that as well. And then balancing your narrative with exploration, and specifically that has to do with incorporating both static and interactive delivery mechanisms. So those of you who are familiar with a tool like Tableau or Power BI or maybe Shiny or something else that has an interactive component to it, it's that idea that you can have a narrative, you can talk about different things, but having the ability to interact with data and explore it in different ways. Obviously, we've all seen how that brings the story to life. So that's another principle there that is very important. Key number 5, and I will admit I'm not doing the best job of this tonight. I'm trying to, we're always trying to improve, but is to develop your presentation and public speaking skills. I think we have all been to conferences where we have seen very, very smart people give horrible, uninteresting, and just mind-numbing presentations simply because they didn't have the proper skills to convey their very interesting or very meaningful message. So this is something I think is very critical that I don't see a lot of people in analytics or data science really focusing on. And there's a few things that you can do. First of all, is just do kind of like what I'm doing right now, even though what I'm doing is virtual. If COVID wasn't here, I would be in the same room with each of you, which is just look for opportunities to do this, sort of push yourself to get out there. I know a lot of people who work in analytics are quite introverted. They don't really like to speak in front of people, but the only way you improve is to actually do it. For those of you who find TED Talks interesting, there are a lot of really useful TED Talks that can help inspire you in improving your ability to present effectively. The trick to something like this is, especially if the TED Talk is very, very interesting, we tend to focus on the message. That is, what is the speaker conveying or what is the story? If you do this, what I would encourage you to do is try to ignore the story itself and focus more on what is it that makes the presentation captivating. What does the tone of voice sound like? What is their body language like? What choices of words are they using? How are they putting pauses into their presentation to create some drama or to create some tension? That's what you want to focus on if you're going to do something like that. Try to ignore the message and focus on what are the elements that are making it captivating. A few rules of thumb that if you were giving a presentation like to a group of people and you're actually in the meeting, a few things you want to do is don't turn your back and look at the projector screen. Have a laptop in front of you, have the screen somewhere in front of you, and look at that so that you can face your audience. Work to articulate and pronounce words clearly to facilitate understanding. This is especially important with very complex words, or if you might not be a native English speaker, this is something you may need to work on a little bit. And, this point number 3, this is the one I'm not doing so good on tonight, or so well on tonight, I should grammatically say, is to eliminate the crutch words, when you can't think of the word, pause and allow some silence. And then finally, keep your composure, not if, but when things go wrong. Because if you do this enough, at some point, something is going to happen. Your PowerPoint freezes up, you forget your data, you pass out the wrong handouts, the lights go out, the power goes out, something is going to happen. The important point about this is if that happens and you're able to keep your composure, especially if you're presenting to executives, they're going to notice that. They're going to notice, okay, here's someone that can maintain their composure in a stressful situation versus someone who freaks out. And the last suggestion I would make, and going back to how I met Alan years ago, is to join a Toastmasters club. And this is a great avenue for, a great venue, I should say, for practicing these skills. I will say, I've actually not been involved in several years. They've changed the program that they used to do it a few years ago, but it's still a great organization, a great venue for practicing and getting some feedback. So we've all been through school, and we've all been taught how to structure a paper, a presentation, a thesis, a dissertation, whatever the case may be. And it usually looks something like this. We start with our introduction, and then our body is made up of all of our supporting information. And sometimes it's very detailed, it's very mind-numbing. Sometimes it goes into a lot of information. And then finally, thank God, at the very end, you get to the conclusion and you understand, okay, now I finally understand what this is all about. So one thing I would encourage you to think about is to flip that upside down and approach it from this perspective. That is, forget the outline approach that you learned all through school, and instead start your presentation by focusing on the so what. That is the bottom line. What is the most important takeaway that you have from your presentation? So instead of the conclusion being at the very end, which is what most people are interested in the first place, start with that up front. The reason that's important is because there's a few things. First of all, if you're presenting to a group of executives, many of whom may not have time to sit through, or the attention span to sit through a 30 or 60-minute presentation for you to finally get to the conclusion, this gets right to the point. And if they have to leave in 5 or 10 minutes, they already know the basis or the final point or the gist of the whole presentation right up front. Something I've found actually is that if you start with that, it often will get people engaged to the point where they want to stick around and understand what makes that conclusion so, especially if it's something that's somewhat surprising or unorthodox or unique. Wow, you came to that conclusion? Really? Help me understand more. And this is, you'll see the rest of this, and this is called the Mento pyramid principle, by the way. I didn't mention this. It's a another person who was involved with McKenzie several years ago. Her name's Barbara Mento. She was a longtime McKenzie consultant. But it's starting with the bottom line. Then from there, you go to the next level and provide your supporting themes and key points. So you're still at kind of a somewhat high level here in the middle. And then at the bottom, that's where you finally get to your details, your data, your evidence, which is basically numbers 2, B, C, and D in the original outline. So it is, for those of you who've not really taken this approach before, it takes some practice because we've not been taught to present this way. But for executives, it can be very effective. And if you're trying to be an effective data translator, you want to get to the meat of your presentation as quickly as possible. And then you can take your audience to a lower level. So finally, this is something that I don't think many of us really need to think much about, because I think most of us really do this on a regular basis, which is obviously you want to continually cultivate your technical skills. You want to always be learning new tools, new methods, new techniques, new models, keeping up on those sorts of things. That's going to enable you to always be at the top of your craft. So the things I'm going to mention here are pretty obvious. You can take some formal classes or additional degrees. You can do MOOCs such as Coursera, edX, etc. Different relevant certifications. There's a certification that I've had for a while called the Certified Analytics Professional. That is, I've found it to be really rewarding, and I'm happy to chat with any of you about it. But I actually did that back in 2014, and it's opened a lot of doors for me. And it was something I did primarily as just a career enhancer and something I wanted to accomplish, and it's really helped me. Obviously, you can work through books. I think we all have several of those. And then you want to find projects. You don't want to just learn things and not have a way to apply them. And the reason that I include this technical skills point within this particular presentation, obviously, like I said, this is something we all do, the important point is that as you're developing new technical skills, that will be opening more opportunities up for you to apply what you know to real life business problems. It's that idea that, you know, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. Well, if you have a more robust toolbox, you have more and more opportunities to apply the skills that you know to the business. So the good news with this, and this should actually read, analytics translators are in increasingly high demand. That was a mistake I made and I didn't correct it in time, but assume the word data says analytics translators. This is what I spoke of at the beginning. There's a very high demand for this, and as these worlds continue to diverge, the leaders of organizations are going to really need to understand what it is that we're doing. Another thing to keep in mind is that most of the skills that I've presented here are the same ones that are valued across multiple roles. That is, they're not unique to analytics. So if you decide at some point in your career that you want to pivot away from an analytics focused role, maybe you want to go into operations, maybe you want to go into marketing, maybe you want to go into sales, whatever the case may be, most of the skills that we've talked about here are going to benefit you in those areas just as much as they would in analytics. So it really is beneficial in a lot of ways. The ability to think analytically is becoming an increasingly critical skill for managers and executives. That's something I think that has always been expected, at least to some degree. You know, if you did an MBA program 20, 25, 30 years ago, you probably took at least some course in quantitative methods or something like that. But the world that we're in today, every manager is expected to be able to think analytically and to think critically about how they consume information, how they utilize information to drive their business and to make decisions. So this is, again, a critical skill that you will develop and can benefit you in other ways down the road. Most of what I've presented here are, what we typically call softer skills. And focusing on these while simultaneously cultivating your technical and analytic skills, what I mentioned in key number 6, this is going to prepare you for multiple career opportunities. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, this is all the things that we talked about here today are going to benefit you in your role as an analyst and help you become a more effective communicator and translator of the work you're doing and the importance that it has to the organization from an analytics perspective. But focusing on these other skills, communication, problem statements, problem solving, iteration, all these different things that we've talked about is going to really greatly enhance your opportunities in your career versus or compared to someone who doesn't have those skills. Someone who may be extremely technically talented, but can't communicate with the business leaders, can't present information effectively so that other people understand it. They're actually going to be limited. They may still have a lot of great opportunities, but not as much as if they were able to effectively communicate. So to wrap up, I did end up taking the full hour, contrary to what I thought. First of all, understand your organization from an executive point of view. Define problems thoroughly and accurately before you start diving into the data. Be a collaborator, not just a responder or a data regurgitator, as I call it. Go from data to story. Make sure that you can present your information in a way that's compelling to an audience. Develop your presentation and public speaking skills so that you can convey that message as effectively as possible. And then finally, continually cultivate your technical skills so that you don't let those go by the wayside as well. That's all the information I have. I appreciate your attention. This is my contact info I'll leave up in case anyone wants to reach out. And I will say I'm not all that active on Twitter. I've got the handle there, but I look at it maybe twice a month, if that. But I'm open for any questions, any thoughts, any feedback, comments anyone might have. Appreciate your attention.
Hi, Eric. I'm Lori. I've got a quick question. You mentioned professional certifications. I'm just entering this profession. What are some of the like ones for that are good to know about for those of us who are new?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a couple, you know, the one I mentioned earlier it's called the Certified Analytics Professional. And I think the website for it, I believe, is certifiedanalytics.org. And it was developed by an organization called Informs, which is it stands for the Institute for Operations Research and Management Science. I think they're looking to possibly change their name. There's a lot of conversation going on with that. But anyway, it's a very robust. What I really like about it is it's framed around this idea or this framework called the analytics job task analysis, which has to do with all of the elements of the process of delivering analytics. Some of you who have been in analytics for a while may be familiar or have heard of a model called CRISP-DM, which was developed in the late 90s. It stands for the Cross-Industry Standard Platform, or Standard Process, for data mining. Obviously, we don't use the term data mining anymore, but the process is still very much relevant. But the CAP certification is focused around the domains of everything from problem statement or problem definition all the way through deployment and everything in between. So that's one that I highly recommend. There have been a lot of very well-known organizations that have been involved in the development of that. Perhaps one of the most prominent is UPS. And I think their head of analytics from a few years ago was part of the development team for the original certification. And they actually have most of their analytics positions at this point now require that certification. So they only consider people who have that certification. I know and I'll be honest with you, I haven't kept up on the certifications as much in the last few years. I know EMC, which is aligned with Dell, used to have, and I think they still do have, a certification called the Data Science Associate. I think you might see it referred to as the EMC DSA. It's focused on data science, and it has continued to evolve. I don't know if that's still available. I remember I first learned about it a few years ago, but that's another one. And then you'll see a lot of certifications. Like, for example, I see someone posted something about SaaS. You will see a lot of certifications that are around particular tools, especially commercial tools like SaaS. And those are, it's not that I wouldn't recommend them necessarily, but keep in mind that any kind of certification that you're going to get that is focused on a particular tool or type of software or mainframe system like an Oracle certification or something like that is going to be limited to that particular tool. So if you're at an organization that utilizes a system like that and you expect that you're going to stay there for a while, or you feel like getting a certification for that particular program is going to help your career at that organization, and by all means, you can pursue that. Just know that that's a little bit more focused than something like a CAP certification would be.
Thank you.
Hey, Kim, good to see you. I didn't realize you were on.
Thank you.
And in particular, so there was the one question about an opportunity to get a SaaS-based program certificate or Security Plus certificate through a veterans program. I will say I'm not really familiar with Security Plus. What I'll say about SaaS in particular, and I know Christine is a master SaaS programmer, so she may have something to add to this as well. SaaS is still very much relevant, but it has become much less relevant in the data science world within the last 10 years or so. SaaS originally was founded in 1976. It stands for Statistical Analysis System. And it's a massive program. And there are a lot of organizations who have decades of legacy SaaS code running all kinds of programs and systems. So for some organizations, it's almost impossible for them to move away from SaaS. But there are still a lot of organizations that use it, and I think SAS is pivoting and has pivoted a bit in a few years to try to become a little bit more relevant in the data science world. But SAS is a commercial program, and it, for an organization, can be very, very expensive. So data scientists typically tend to gravitate more toward open source tools like R or Python or many of the other tools that are open source. So I don't hear a lot of data scientists necessarily clamoring to get certifications in SAS. I've seen, if you think about statistical programs in general, there's SAS. There's one called Jump that SAS actually owns. It's actually really cool, but it's very, very niche. There's SPSS, which for those of you who have taken maybe marketing classes or graduate school, you may have had experience with that one. That actually stands for the Statistical Program for the Social Sciences. IBM purchased it several years ago. Minitab is one that used to be a lot more prominent than it is now, and it's sort of become, its niche is really, I think, more in manufacturing and Six Sigma and things of that nature. So all that to say is that it's not a bad idea to get a certificate in something like SAS, but just be aware that it might not be as broadly applicable outside of an organization, especially outside of an organization that doesn't use that tool. So if you're a master SAS programmer and then you leave that organization and you go to an organization that doesn't use SAS anywhere, it's not going to do you a lot of good in that particular job. Obviously, you would have other benefits from that, but just something to be aware of. So any other questions or comments, thoughts?
This is Alan. I'm thrilled that you remembered me after all these years.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember you and Bill Corbett and Laura Cox and I forget the guy's name who what was his name? Oh, Clark Capshaw.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of those guys from quite a while ago.
But just to reiterate what Eric said, I was probably the nerdiest, most scared guy in the world going into Toastmasters, and literally towards the end, I ended up having to give a presentation to a large group, and it really set me up pretty well to do it.
Great. Yeah, I haven't been active for quite some time, but I feel like it's really helped me in a lot of ways when I've had to give presentations, or even when I've just had to have conversations with people. The ability to structure your thoughts on the fly is something you learn. Any other thoughts? I appreciate each of you taking the time to be here this evening. I'm sorry we couldn't meet in person. Hopefully at some point soon we will be in a position where we can actually all be in the same room together. I don't know when that's going to happen, but we'll see. And I used to be part of the organizing group for this meetup, and so I'm very glad to see that Lucas and Christine are still leading the charge and keeping this group going, because I've really made a lot of great connections through this over the years. I haven't been as active just because of time commitments, but I'm glad to be a part of it and hope to continue to be involved and eventually see all of you in person at some point.
Well, Eric, you are still in our operations team. We still, so you can't run away from us. So whenever you have some downtime, think about us, think about our meetup, and try to connect us with some of your friends, and like another good speaker like you coming to our meetup to give such a wonderful presentation as you did. Yeah, nice.
Well, thank you. Oh, I do want to make a last point. I have seen a couple of people mention the Analytics Summit, and Lucas obviously mentioned it early on. If you have never been to the Analytics Summit, I highly encourage you to attend. This year, it's going to be a mix of, assuming that everything is okay by September, it's going to be a mix of in-person and virtual this year. If I have the dates correct, and I believe I do, it's September 20th and 21st. And we've had it at the Omni Hotel downtown for the last few years. And just to give you an idea of it, when we started the summit in 2013, we had 85 people show up. Last year, which was our 7th year of doing it, we had over 800. And so we've grown, in attendance-wise, we've grown basically tenfold in 7 years. So it's now becoming a regional event. It's not just Nashville. It's now like a Southeast event. And we actually have people from various areas of the country. And some of you may have heard the name Hillary Mason before. She's a very, very well-known data scientist, especially in the US. She's going to be our keynote speaker, which we've been trying to get her as our keynote for several years. And we finally made it happen this year. So just make a note of that. If you're I'll tell you the website, if you want to check it out, is just, I'll just type it here since the chat box is up. It's the Analytics Summit crap, I think it's .com. It's either, I'm pretty sure it's .com, but it might be .org. I don't remember exactly, but that's the web address if you want to check it out. Thank you. As soon as I typed it, I couldn't remember what it was. It's through the Nashville Tech Council, and it's an incredible event. You will meet so many people there and learn so much. So I highly recommend that you make the time for that.
And Eric, you might have already mentioned that the summit is not limited to healthcare industry. Actually, like all over, all kinds of industry, like marketing, maybe financial world, as just anything to do with analytics.
That's right, and it was through. I mentioned it was through Christine, but it was also through involvement in the Analytics Summit was how I transitioned from the music industry to healthcare. Because the first 2 years of the summit, I was actually still in the music industry, and then got introduced to Ed Marks through Christine to get into healthcare. What I will say is this, starting last year, so this is our 2nd year to do it, we've actually started partnering with Tennessee HIMSS. I know some of you are probably familiar with HIMSS. It's the Healthcare Information Management Systems Society. It's a national organization, and there's a Tennessee chapter. But we have started, as of last year, partnering with Tennessee HIMSS, and there is a healthcare track within the Analytics Summit. So there is a component to it that is focused on healthcare. I mean, it is Nashville after all, but Christine is right. There are presentations and people from all different industries and all different areas. So you'll see everything from business intelligence to data security to data science to machine learning to ethics to we're probably going to have some presentations on COVID as well. We just haven't finalized those yet. Well, that's all I have. I mean, I'm happy to answer any other questions. But I'll turn it back over to Lucas.
All right. That was excellent, Eric. So, some of those things were great reminders. Some were additional thoughts, great ideas. And a lot of it too are things that are what I've seen people distinguish themselves in this field with, and really grow their careers, by getting better at and focusing on. It's funny, I've worked in a couple organizations as well and teams, and to have to see how valuable that is to be able to explain the analytics, to build trust in folks, to be able to operationalize the findings and encourage people to act on them. You covered a lot of core pieces. So I appreciate that. This was great information.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I think that concludes our presentation. Thanks everybody for attending. See you next time.
Thank you. Yeah. So if anyone that has an idea that you want to do, just like Eric suggests, try to get more opportunity to make a public speech, to make a presentation, and to cultivate your presentation skill. And feel free to contact us, contact Lucas, Jason, me, or Chad, or even Eric. Eric, you are still in our operation. So just contact any of us, and we will arrange that. Today is very good. And I think no matter what, we can still meet either in person or in virtual situations. So let us know if you have an idea, you want to do a presentation. Here we provide a platform for you to like do your skill and presentation skill and your analytic skill and sharing with other people at the same time. So feel free to contact us, and if you want to do so. And thank you for coming today. And thank you very much.
Thank you. See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.